I tend to be very picky with the games I play. I generally only play one game at a time, and I generally play it until it's played out. This is the only way that I have found that I get great satisfaction from gaming. And that's because, in my opinion, most games are a waste of time. We all live at a unique position on the human trajectory in which the currency by which we interact with the world is less and less to do with survival or family. It's less to do even with technology or even money. What we spend our time doing is the actual currency we spend. We spend that time on learning, working, upkeep, relaxation, connection, and more. But with game studios, retail websites, streaming services, and political ideologues all vying for a piece of that time, things are different these days. For one, everyone's much better at convincing you to spend your time on them, and time's the one thing you can't get back. At least that's what we're led to believe. The capital T truth is that time isn't real in the sense that most of us believe it to be, and it's just a practical way for us to engage with each other in synchronicity. So really, if I follow that logic, what we spend our time on should mostly be practical in its value, and therefore the games I spend my time on should probably provide some practical value of their own. Wasting time on games is not why I show up to my computer desk most nights. So, how do you play a game without wasting time? Let me introduce you to Nova Drift. Nova Drift combines smoothly flashy, spacey visuals with a throwback asteroids-like play area and a galactic-sized tune-up in terms of game complexity, skill requirements, and replayability. If this reminds you of a classic arcade feel, then you're sitting in the right nostalgic space. But the game borrows from advances in the roguelike gaming culture, design, technology to keep each play feeling fresh and unique. So why Nova Drift, Slight? Why this game? Why is this game not a waste of time? I'd like to suggest you consider the distinction that some games are meant to be played and other games are meant to be experienced. Stick with me. I'd also like to suggest that most big studio games of the last 10 years have focused more on developing an experience for the player as opposed to developing a game that a player can play. This distinction is one that originates from the initial design perspective. The tailored experience is data and demographically driven. The game design studio needs to elicit the intended and optimal emotional, intellectual, and social experience to maximize the target audience's key desired outcomes, which will then maximize profit for the studio. These outcomes might be: the player garners a positive outlook of the game, the player garners a positive outlook of the studio, the player shares key epic experiences on social media, the player recognizes key design elements that are likely to be targeted for content talking points so they can engage in a discussion about the game. Recognize that these data-driven player experience outcomes are focused not on the game, but on the ability for the game to elicit the target outcomes. In this way, the game is created by data collected about target audiences and then attached to some existing framework. In contrast, a game that is meant to be played is fundamentally driven by a personal experience that occurs within the developers before an audience is ever even considered. Recognize that the experience-driven outcomes do not include statements like, "We want to design a game that is fundamentally unique and challenges players in a new way. We want to design a game that is tailored to the trajectory of a specific community, but not tailored to what that community wants right at this moment. We want to design a game that pays due respect to something we love. We want to design a game that we think should exist." Remember, these are the initial driving forces for the design process, and in practice, these two design perspectives are mixed together. But I'd like to make the case that almost every game is either played or experienced, with very few games finding a middle ground. So, despite there being a mix of design perspectives, the outcomes and the interaction with the player tends to be very much one or the other. Since the experience game is first and foremost customer and demographically driven, experiences that do not meet the demographic requirements are removed or never developed. The game already has an audience, and the game does nothing to challenge or change that audience. In fact, the game would be hurt by challenging its audience to change, since it was specifically designed for them at a specific time. Changing the audience would hurt profits and key outcomes, since the basis for those outcomes would now be different. The played game is first and foremost design driven. The game is not meant to meet a specific audience. In fact, an audience finds the game, and through finding the game, both audience and game are changed. The audience must adapt to what is required of them to stay an audience, sometimes painfully so, in order to reach the desired outcomes that they have within themselves, to reach the outcomes they wish to achieve as a player. On the other hand, the game is changed as it finds an audience because it must adapt to the needs of that audience, and to ensure the developer's personal design experience can be understood by the audience. Played games are designed because they should exist, and the developers don't initially care whether the game manages to elicit desired key outcomes beyond the outcomes that the designer themselves feels within their own game. If there is a difference between what the designer feels when they play and what the player feels when playing, that dissonance often gets addressed, since the designer's essential goal is to recreate a personal experience for an unrealized audience. And so, I would like to suggest, humbly, that Nova Drift is a game that is meant to be played, and not a game that is meant to be experienced. It is a game with a challenging learning curve, somewhat unintuitive controls, a massive depth of potential game knowledge, and a 96% approval rating over 6.7K reviews on Steam. The game clearly has found an audience, or rather, an audience has manifested itself for the game. Were the game meant to be experienced, on the other hand, at the very beginning I would be able to lower the difficulty. I would be able to use easier controls that fundamentally unbalance the game. I wouldn't be given so many upgrade options at the start, or ever for that matter. With this many options, the average video game consumer would never play them all, and therefore we should not develop them. That would be a waste of money. With as many different choices and as many different options for theory crafting, most players are going to get overwhelmed, and that'll scare them off, which risks our branding, which risks long-term profit projections. Nova Drift, as it is, would never be made by a large design studio, and that's a great indication that it's worth your time. Remember that to actually play a game, you must change. To be an audience for a game that is meant to be played, you must change to remain an audience. To experience what the game designer intended, which was fundamentally a personal experience, you must occupy a space that wasn't necessarily intended for you. And by doing that, you grow, you change, you become different, in that you must become different to understand something that exists outside of yourself. To truly empathize, you must fundamentally alter your perspective. This is why I'm so picky with the games I play. Most games do not offer me any meaningful opportunity toward growth or change. Most games are made specifically to maximize profit for a given market parameter, and by doing so, they lose the very soul of play. By creating an experience for a target demographic, designers seek to freeze that demographic in time, offering no meaningful room for growth beyond the illusion of experienced growth within the game, which is starkly different than the reality of growth, since real growth fundamentally requires suffering. Learning is hard and painful, but having learned is extremely satisfying. So let's answer this question directly. Why Nova Drift? Number 1, the game has an immense depth for theory crafting, which is right up my alley. As a man who was birthed in the coals of Dota 1, games that merge skill and knowledge as equal parts of high skill play are always going to scratch a particular itch for me. They give me an approximation of what is required of me to perform in the real world, whether I am writing code, mowing the lawn, discussing difficult topics with my loved ones, etc. The same skills I use to explore and understand a game are used in all of those areas, and it gives me a way to practice those skills in a lower risk environment. Specifically, the essential skill that's being developed is the ability to learn and understand a complex topic. The skill of being able to teach myself how to align my assumptions about a topic closer and closer to the reality of that topic until I have gained mastery over it. Number 2. The game has been made with community in mind. There's a powerfully tight community on the Nova Drift Discord. You'll find players who are rather devoted to Nova Drift because of how integrated the development of the game has been with the community that surrounds it. We see that the audience and the game have undergone change together in the way that a game that's meant to be played must change. Number 3, the game has a clear roadmap to release, which suggests even more depth of content as the game goes further into development. Currently, we're sitting at Phase 1, with significant progress having been made toward Phase 2. Number 4, I know there's been significant progress on Phase 2 because, as a stark breath of fresh air, the small developer team for Nova Drift has excellent communication skills, which is an area that has been an issue for me in the past with Gunfire Reborn. Just recently, I read through the announcements on the Nova Drift Discord and found a Phase 2 update, as well as a long-form developer essay from the last major update that the game received earlier this year. This particular section really stood out to me and illuminated the type of person this developer is.
When you get a large amount of feedback, it's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to please everyone. You should consider it certainly, but I think at the core of making a good game is the desire to make the game that you want to exist. For example, Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is a game that generates no small amount of negative reviews or returns. It is insanely difficult and unforgiving, but it is also unabashedly what it is, and it has earned a place in the gaming history and is very successful for it. Similarly, Nova Drift isn't a twin-stick shooter. It was always going to have that working against it, and I knew that. So really, it should come as no surprise that Nova Drift is becoming less well received as it exits its safe, comfy, retro indie sphere and delves into the realm of the broader, often more casual audience. And I do think that's what's happening. It's no coincidence that its struggles coincide with its sales. For me, it's just a matter of accepting that because I didn't realize how sheltered the game was within my very forgiving and supportive community. And 99% positive reviews is a long way to fall down from. I recognize that's my ego talking, and I want to work on that because developing under this level of self-criticism and neuroticism just isn't sustainable. So I've been thinking a lot about how I'm going to change that, and in the end I think it means making the game that I want to make. Listening but being reactive. Not being attached to any outcome and just developing for the love of it. After all, that's what made Nova Drift my dream job many years ago.
After reading this, I posted in the Discord that I really appreciated this level of communication, and lo and behold, the dev responded to say thank you for the kind words. I cannot express how refreshing it is to be able to speak plainly to a small developer and to be understood. If you followed my previous work in Gunfire Reborn, you'll know how difficult it was to talk to the devs. Some of that can be forgiven because of the language barrier, but it's not all that affected that line of communication. So, I already have my first video of Nova Drift getting lined up, though I recognize with only 10 hours of game time that it will be fundamentally inferior to other players' understanding of the game, but I hope, as I did with Gunfire Reborn, that I can inspire you to challenge yourself as I am doing, inspire you to see the depth in the act of true play, and inspire you to consider your life in the very terms that you consider games. for there is much hitherto unexplored territory in the space where life and play blur together. Hope to see you fly in on a supernova sometime soon, and you know the drill. I make these videos for fun. I make them for me. So only sub if you want to see more of them. If you do sub, do not sub for me. Sub for you.